In this video, I'm going to explain why you should stop just randomly wetting your watercolour paper for no reason. I'm Michelle, and on this channel you'll find art business advice, art tips, particularly watercolour tips and watercolour pigment mixing, so do consider subscribing. Now in this video I'm going to talk about one of the main things that I see beginners getting into trouble with when I walk around my art classes. So I've been teaching watercolour painting for maybe 15 years now, and often I see the same things happening again and again, and one of the biggest problems is that beginners have a tendency to just chuck a load of water on their paper without really understanding why they're doing it. Now, why do beginners put water on their paper? Well, there are several reasons why they do it. Firstly, they understand that it can help you to avoid drying lines with hard edges in your paintings that don't look very good. The other reason is they've just seen a lot of people do it. So they've watched professional artists and they've seen a few YouTube videos, they've seen a few tips, and they've watched their tutor, and they think that this is just what you do before you start painting with watercolours. So what tends to happen is I walk around my class and I see somebody, I say, right, let that bit dry, and then if you can paint that bit next to it with these colours, maybe do some wet into wet. And by the time I've walked around the room and come back to them, what quite often happens is I look at their painting and they've pretty much ruined it, because what they've done is they've chucked a load of clean water across the area that I told them to let dry and across the area they want to paint. And they're putting paint on, the paint is following the water, so the paint's going everywhere and they've got no control over everything. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about when you actually need to wet your watercolour paper. Now, there are specific techniques where you do wet the paper first, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. If you are doing one of those techniques, then it's great to wet the paper first. So when you might wet the paper is if you were painting a sky. Say you had a fresh bit of paper and you put some water on, and then you might put the blue in and get those nice soft edge clouds. That's fine. Another reason you would wet the paper is if you want the paint that's going on top to be soft edged. For example, if I had painted a beach and I wanted to put some darker shadows on, but I didn't want those hard drying lines, then I could wet the beach and then put the darker colour on top. But that's not to say that this is something you should always do. There's far, far too much chucking of water around on watercolour paintings without any clue as to why people are doing it. So when do you not need to wet your paper first? Well, first of all, if you want a clean, crisp edge, then you certainly shouldn't put water all over the paper, because the water is just going to cause the paint to bleed across. So paint will always follow water, so if there's a damp area, wet paint, it's just asking for trouble. It's going to bleed right into that area. So don't put water across an edge where you want a hard drying line. But there are other occasions when people seem to think that you need to wet the paper when actually you don't. One is a flat wash. If you're putting a flat wash of colour, either in a large area like a sky or a smaller area, then you don't need to pre-wet the paper. All you're doing is diluting the paint. You've not got more or less control over it, but you're just diluting it, and you're going to end up with not very bright colours. The other time people think that you need to pre-wet the paper is if you're painting wet into wet in an area. So you don't need to pre-wet for this. Now, what you do need to do is make sure that your brush is nice and wet with paint. You never want to put your brush on the paper when there's very little paint on it, and using a big enough brush will help with this. You need to have plenty of paint on the brush. What that does is that enables the paint to flow, and it gives you a bit of time. It's not going to dry the second you put it on the paper, and you're not going to get those drying lines straight away. So use a big enough brush and use enough paint, but you don't always have to pre-wet the surface. So you can paint wet into wet. I sometimes do put a little bit of clean water on the paper just where I'm about to put the brush first on, and I'll show you how to do that. And then I work wet into wet from there. But pre-wetting the paper, it doesn't give you any advantage, and it does dilute your paint. And if you're a complete beginner, what I would say to you is don't wet the paper unless you know why you're doing it. In fact, in life, don't do anything unless you know why you're doing it. So you may have seen other people do it, but don't just randomly chuck water on your paper is what I'm saying. If there's a specific technique that you have learned or you've been shown that need you to pre-wet the paper in a specific area, then do that. Okay, that is absolutely fine. I'm not saying you should never pre-wet your paper, but if you don't know why you're wetting your paper, just don't do it. Ask some advice, have a think about what the water will do, because too much water on your paper is just going to cause your paint to bleed everywhere. You'll have no control over it. You do not need to pre-wet for a flat wash, and you do not need to pre-wet when you're working wet into wet necessarily. Okay, so I hope you have found this of some use to you. Do please consider subscribing, hit the like button so I know you liked the video, and feel free to share it.